this one. There we go. So can everybody see my screen? Okay, see the biology classwork section that has week 6 up at the top.
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate it. All right. So today we're going to finish up talking about cell transport and the way that things are able to move in and out of cells. The assignment, the homework for today is extremely similar to the one that you did on Tuesday, where you have the notes with the blanks that go right along with the notes that we're about to go over. And so it should be hopefully pretty easy to either work on it as we're going through the notes today or right afterwards. So we're still continuing on with our cell transport notes that we started last time. So we ended last time talking about diffusion and osmosis. So those two forms of passive transport, so they don't need any energy in order for them to happen. They happen naturally. And then we talked about osmosis, so that movement specifically of water from over a membrane from high concentration to low concentration. We talked about those hypotonic and hypertonic and isotonic solutions where you have more solute or less solute or an equal amount with your membrane, with your cell. And so you mentioned that the more solute that you have, the less water that you have, right? If you have 40% solute, that means you only have 60% water. And we talked about how hypotonic means you have low solute, high water. And so since the water is high, it's going to naturally move away into a hypertonic solution. So hyper means high solute, low water. So water, through osmosis, goes from a high concentration to a low concentration. Hypotonic solutions have a lot of water. Hypertonic solutions do not have as much water. They're more solute focused. So if osmosis can happen naturally, the water is going to go from high to low until it becomes isotonic, where it's an equal amount of water inside and outside of the membrane. So that's kind of where we wrapped things up on Tuesday. So we kind of talked Tuesday about very general ideas about a basic membrane and diffusion and osmosis happening across it. And so today we're going to get a little bit more into exactly how cells transport things across their membranes. Sometimes they can do it through things like diffusion and osmosis where they don't need energy. Sometimes they have to do it with using energy. So the membrane of a cell, the lipid membrane, is what's called hydrophobic. That just means that it's hard for stuff to move through a cell's membrane. So even really, really small molecules like water and amino acids and sugars cannot just go straight through the membrane, right? The membrane blocks out a lot of stuff from getting through there. Instead, they go through transport proteins. So a transport protein is just a special protein that's kind of embedded in the membrane of a cell. And its entire goal is to help stuff get across the membrane. either go into a cell or leave from a cell. So almost all molecules have to travel through a transport protein to get in and out of cells. So in a lot of cases, stuff is able to naturally move into or out of the cell. And so because it is diffusing and not using any energy, but it's still helped by these transport proteins, it's called facilitated diffusion. So the particles, the molecules, are still moving from high concentration to low concentration. They're still going from a concentrated to a less concentrated area. It's just that they can't do it directly across the membrane, so these proteins help move them across. But they still don't need energy in order to move. They naturally want to go across the membrane, either out or in. They just need these proteins to help kind of give them a way, give them like, it's essentially like a walkway or a street for them to go through. Hey, Breeze, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So facilitated diffusion, it's still diffusion, so we're still not using energy. It just, instead of happening totally naturally, it's using a protein to help it out, get across that membrane. So water has special proteins in the cell membrane called aquaporins. And down here, and that goes away. So aquaporins are what let water move in and out of the cell. Again, it still is going to move based on its concentration. So it's still going to go from wherever it's high to wherever it's low. It just can't do that directly across the membrane. So these aquaporins, these water transport proteins, naturally, with no energy, let the water move from one side to the other. So it still wants to happen. It still naturally happens. It just has these transport proteins helping it out. So there are two different types of transport proteins out there. There are channel proteins and carrier proteins. And the nice thing about these proteins, like some things in science, is that their name basically tells you what they do or what job that they have. So channel proteins are literally like that. It's like a little opening in the cell membrane. So they allow these particles to just naturally go in and out of the cell. They provide like a little mini walkway, a little mini tube for the particles to get in and out. So it's like a channel, it's like an opening. It's like a little stream or a little river that the particles can use to cross that membrane. So normally, like over here and over here, the membrane keeps these particles out. They can't get through, they can't cross. But with the channel protein, there's a little hole that they're able to just slide right through. So in this particular picture, the particles are going to go through facilitated diffusion from the bottom of the picture to the top of the picture. They're more dense down here. They're less dense up here. So they're naturally going to flow through the channel protein to this side over here. They're going to go through this little opening that the protein is providing. Carrier proteins, instead of being a little opening, they are specific for certain molecules. So not just anything can get into a carrier protein. It has to be this certain molecule. And whenever that molecule binds, it causes the carrier to move to the other side of the membrane and release it. So it's sort of like, if you remember when we talked about enzymes back a couple weeks ago, how they bind to certain molecules in certain ways. Carrier proteins are kind of similar to that. So instead of just kind of naturally letting the particle move through like a channel protein, instead it carries it across, just like the name said. Again, still does not require any energy. In this case, we can't really see it, but we can assume that there's a high concentration of red particles down here and a low concentration of red particles down here. So this red particle is naturally going to want to transfer across to this side, and the carrier protein is going to kind of basically envelop it in a hug and carry it and release it on the other side. So it takes it in from one side, carries it, and releases it to the other side. Still doesn't need any energy because the particle naturally wants to flow in that direction anyways. It's just kind of being a little bit of a helper. It's just helping out this little red particle who otherwise would be stuck because he can't get through the membrane on his own. He has to be helped along by this carrier protein. So we've got channel proteins, which are just basically little holes in a protein in the cell membrane. And we've got these carrier proteins. They both act through facilitated diffusion. So they both are just helping diffusion and osmosis naturally happens. They're just needed because otherwise the particles could not cross the membrane, even though they want to go from the high concentration to the low concentration areas. All right, so any questions so far on facilitated diffusion, channel proteins, carrier proteins, anything that we've talked about up till now?
No question.
Was that Amanda? Did you have a question, Amanda?
I think she said no question.
No.
Okay, cool. Just making sure. All right. So all of this is still passive transport. It still is all happening, no energy needed, just kind of happening naturally. Where we do need the energy to kick in is in the case of active transport. So sometimes cells want to get rid of stuff that is a low concentration inside the cell or a high concentration out. Even though it's set up like that, the cell still wants it out. Or maybe the cell has a high concentration of a certain particle inside, but it still wants to bring more and more to the inside of the cell. It is possible for cells to do this. They do it all the time. It's called active transport. And the reason it's called active is because instead of happening naturally, in this case, we're fighting the concentration gradient. We're taking a particle from somewhere low and putting it somewhere high. It's going the opposite direction that it normally would want to. So it's like this guy on roller skates down here. It was easy to go down the hill, but it's going to require energy and effort in order to go back up the hill. Same thing with active transport. The cell is going to need energy to push things from a low concentration to a high concentration area. That energy that it's going to need, you may remember it when we talked about the mitochondria last week. They make it, and it's called ATP. So ATP is a cellular energy source, and one of its uses is in active transport. Those membrane proteins, when they're going in the opposite direction, when they're fighting diffusion, they can use energy in order to make that happen. So passive transport and facilitated diffusion are all no energy high to low types of transport. Active transport needs energy. We're taking something from a low place and moving it to a high concentration place. So we need this ATP energy. One type of movement is done through something called a membrane pump. So this is a basic type of active transport, where again, all about moving against the concentration gradient, going from a low concentration area to a high concentration area. So a membrane pump is part of the active transport system. So it's one of the types of cell membrane proteins to help out. So the basic way that it works is when we want to pump a particle into the cell, when we want to actively transport something into the cell, the particle that we're pumping comes in to the pump, then an ATP molecule swings by, and when ATP gets broken down into its smaller components, so ADP and phosphate PO4 are the two of the smaller structures that make ATP together. So when we break that ATP apart, it gives the protein energy to fight the concentration gradient and pump that particle into the cell. So it's active transport because we're using energy. We're using ATP. We're breaking an ATP molecule apart. When we break it apart, it releases energy, and the membrane protein uses that energy to take the particle against the concentration gradient. So active transport, all about energy, needing that energy to force the particles where the cell wants them to go. So we start off with 3 ATPs, but in order to move 3 particles from the outside to the inside, we're going to one by one convert those 3 ATPs into 3 pairs of ADP and PO4. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, like 3. ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate, like 2. So when we break off one of those phosphates, it goes from a 3-phosphate to a 2-phosphate group. You don't really need to know that, but that's why the ATP becomes ADP. It breaks a phosphate, and that energy gives energy to the protein. So this is a pretty common pump for the cell. It's called the sodium-potassium pump. So sometimes the cell has a lot of sodium, Na, on the inside of the cell, and a lot of potassium, K, on the outside of the cell. And it doesn't want this. It wants those to be switched. So because the sodium is going from high to low, and the potassium is going from high outside to low inside, we need this pump. So again, it's the same basic premise. We're using ATP. In this case, when we break off an ATP, we can let 3 sodiums out and let 2 potassiums in. So every time that this membrane opens and closes using ATP, it releases 2 sodiums and takes in, or releases 3 sodiums and takes in 2 potassiums. So we're using ATP, we're using this cellular energy, in order to force potassium out, or excuse me, to force sodium out and to force potassium in. Normally, they wouldn't want to go out or in because that's not how the concentration is set up, but the cell wants it that way. So the cell is going to use energy in order to force the sodium to leave and to force the potassium to come in. Right? Active transport means using energy, moving things against their concentrations from a low area to a high area. Besides a membrane pump, another thing that cells can do to bring stuff in is endocytosis. So they'll especially use this in order to take in really big molecules or even entire other cells. So like a white blood cell is attacking a bacteria cell, it'll use this endocytosis to kind of completely surround and take in that new cell. This animation is kind of annoying. It only plays once, so I'll go ahead and play it again for you, just to show you what it looks like. We have our little original cell, and then this bigger cell comes and completely like engulfs it, completely takes it over. That's called endocytosis. It's taking it into the inside of the cell. This still requires energy. It still needs energy in order for the big cell to surround and engulf the little cell. The opposite of this is exocytosis. So when the cell releases stuff outside through those little vesicles. So if you remember when we talked about the Golgi body, I mentioned it makes these tiny little vesicles, which are these tiny little cell membrane bubbles. The bubble will come over, fuse with the cell membrane, and release whatever's in the bubble to outside of the cell. But in order for this fusion and for this release to happen, it still requires energy. Right? We're still moving things across against their concentration gradient, and we have to completely reintegrate these little membrane, big membrane. That takes energy. And so this is another form of active transport. We're using energy in order to specifically get rid of stuff from the inside of the cell, thanks to these little vesicles right here. So exocytosis is going out. It's being released, given away, given off from the cell. So endocytosis going in, exocytosis going out. All right, so here I really like this slide because it's a nice summary of kind of everything that we've talked about so far. So we can have across our cell membrane here, we have a high concentration of particles on the outside and a low concentration of particles on the inside. Or I guess you can't really tell inside, outside. But we have high on the top and low on the bottom. So some particles, very few particles, are able to do simple diffusion just directly across the cell membrane. So they don't even need any of these proteins. They're able to diffuse directly across the membrane. This can happen with really, really small particles, but it is pretty rare. The membrane keeps out the vast majority of particles that would try to cross it. So you can also have passive transport, also known as facilitated diffusion, when you have these proteins here. So our channel protein just opens up a little hole in the cell membrane, for the molecule to get through, again, going from high to low, so it doesn't need any energy. We have our carrier protein that can naturally fit a particle inside it and move it to the bottom part of the cell. So again, high to low. So all of these first three are all passive transport. They're all, well, the first one's not transport. These guys are all passive transport. These molecules are naturally moving from the high concentration to the low concentration area through facilitated diffusion, either through a channel or carrier protein. So we don't need any energy to help these guys out. If we have something in the low concentration area and we want to move it into the high concentration area, then we're going to need some energy. We're going to have to go through active transport, use some energy, some ATP, and our little particle will bind to the inside of the protein and then be released on the other side. So these are the same basic movement of particles. One is just going naturally with its concentration gradient, and the other one is using energy to go against the concentration, go from a low to a high area. But they are both binding to a molecule and then releasing it on the opposite side of the membrane. So to review everything all together, passive transport where we don't need any energy involved, we're moving things from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. If it's water, we call it osmosis. If it's anything else, we call it diffusion. And if a transport protein is helping with the process, if we're going across a membrane using a transport protein, it's called facilitated diffusion. So either a channel protein or a carrier protein like these guys can be used for facilitated diffusion, things naturally moving from high to low. Active transport requires energy. We need energy in order to fight that concentration. So we can use a membrane pump to pump particles in and out across the membrane from the low concentration to the high concentration area. So again, this is why we need the energy, because where they don't want to naturally move into a high concentration area, so we need energy to make them move. We can also have endocytosis and exocytosis, where we use energy to manipulate the membrane itself in order to bring something into the cell to kind of grab onto it with the membrane, or to release something through the membrane of the cell. So if we're going into the cell, it's called endocytosis. And if we're leaving the cell through the membrane, it's called exocytosis. All right. So that is pretty much everything that you need to know about cell transport, especially across a membrane. So either we're going along with the concentration and we're helping those particles naturally move from their high to low areas, or we're using energy in order to fight against the concentration, to move things uphill, if it were. So we're putting in energy in order to force particles and molecules to go against their concentration gradient in order to either leave or enter the cell. All right. So does anybody have any final questions about anything that we talked about either tonight or from Tuesday about diffusion, osmosis, passive transport, active transport, cell membranes, permeability, anything from any of these notes that you still have questions about?
No, I'm good, thank you.
No, no questions.
All right, all right. So again, a pretty simple daily assignment that goes with these notes. It's up on the Google Classroom, and it's just another one of sort of the fill in the blank notes. So I want you to make sure you go back over these notes again and kind of pay attention to these important words that I left out and want you to go back and fill in. So most of it is just plain fill in the blank. There's one little section down here where I want you to briefly, in like 1 or 2 sentences, explain what is exocytosis and what is endocytosis. And if you want to use the wording directly from the notes, you are more than welcome to. All right, let me hop back onto our call here.